Hello and welcome to the 18th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation webinar series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I am the CEO of Project MedTech. Today we'll be hearing from Isabella Schmitt and Karen Deep Singh Bodwell for a discussion about building a software as a medical device, or SaMD, and the exciting opportunities and unique challenges that come along with it. First, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is the cloud for medical device makers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant with FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. It's built on 40+ years of collective experience developing compliant systems in the medical device industry. The company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. So that being said, I'd like to welcome our guests. We have Isabella Schmitt, the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Proxima Clinical Research. And we also have Karen Deep Singh Bodwell, who's an independent quality and regulatory consultant who specializes in SaMD and AI medical devices. So with that being said, I think Karen Deep, you are presenting first. But before either one of you present, Karen Deep, can you just do it was a very brief overview, but maybe just a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then Isabella, it'd be great if you could do the same.
Hello everybody, and I'm pleased that we'll be joining us here today on this talk that we have on software as a medical device. In terms of who I am, I'm based in the UK, and as Dwayne touched on, I'm an independent quality and regulatory consultant within medical devices. I started off my career working with traditional devices, pacemakers, defibrillators at large companies such as Abbott and St. Jude Medical. And over the past 2 years, there's been a sudden boom and insurgence in software as medical device and AI due to grant funding and a lot of investor money in there. And that's what I specialize in today.
Want me to go now?
Yeah, be great.
Okay. Okay. Hi, I'm Isabella Schmitt. I am the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Proxima Clinical Research. So I do all things regulatory quality and clinical development. My background is in both biopharma and medical devices. I have, like Karen Deep, a specific interest in SaMDs, AI, machine learning, and that's me. Sorry, I'm a little flustered. I just got on an FDA call and I feel bad for being kind of late and everything. So I'm trying to get my bearings.
No, it's no problem. I was going to mention that as you were logging on, but I figured give you some time to settle in. Yeah, Isabella did have an FDA call pop up right before this, so she's still getting adjusted to being on the webinar now. So Karen Deep, I think you're kicking things off, and you have a presentation for us. So
yeah, regulatory considerations for software as a medical device. That's what I'm going to be talking to you today and providing you a brief summary. So what are the regulatory frameworks? What are the pathways that you can take? And what are the important questions that you should be asking yourself when we're specifically talking about software devices? So the overview I'm going to be providing you today, again, like I touched on, is the regulatory frameworks, the pathway, and the common questions. And the questions I'm hoping to be answering today is, number one, is my software as a medical device product even classed as a regulated medical device? Is my device a software as a medical device only, or is there a PEMS element? And when I talk about PEMS, I'm talking about physical, electrical, mechanical systems. So is there a data collection tool paired with that? What does the regulatory pathway involve for the UK, the US, and the EU? And it's important to distinguish with the UK because those amongst the audience will be aware that in the UK, we had Brexit at the end of 2020. So the UK now has its own regulations that I'll be touching on to in a minute. Number 5 is, what are the intended uses and the claims of your product? Because that is going to be the backbone in terms of what you do from a regulatory point of view and a clinical point of view. And of course, the most famous question that I get is which market to enter first, UK, EU, or US? So what exactly are the regulatory frameworks? So the purposes of today, I'll be covering the UK, the EU, and the USA. Well, there's two sides to this. A traditional medical device would have to, of course, go by the regulations, but as soon as you start mentioning software or artificial intelligence or anything based on any online platform or transmitting data, Another consideration, of course, is cybersecurity, so I'll be covering that also. So within the UK, we have the Medicines and Medical Devices Act of 2021 and the UK Medical Device Regulation of 2002. So what actually happened was Brexit actually occurred before the EU MDR was fully enforced. So what the UK actually did is they got the previous EU Medical Device Directive and called it the UK Medical Device Regulation. So when you see the UK Medical Device Regulation, it's not exactly a new regulation, it's more or less the old EU Medical Device Directive, which is no longer enforced in the UK. And basically, we have the Data Protection Act of 2018. We have UK GDPR and EU GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. Of course, in the EU, as many in the audience will probably be familiar with, we have the EU MDR, which came out on the 26th of May 2021. And also within the EU, we had the General Data Protection Regulation. And there was a proposed regulation 21st of April 2021 for EU AI regulation, but we still see more to that. And of course, within the US, we had the US FDA, and we also have HIPAA, which is basically like the US equivalent of the GDPR. But another point, unlike the UK and the EU, there are also state laws in the US. So as far as I'm aware, in California, you have the California Consumer Privacy Act. So you also need to look to see what state laws are in place when it comes to cybersecurity for this as well. So UK MDR and EU MDR, which is a cause of confusion amongst people. So like I mentioned, the UK MDR is actually the previous EU Medical Device Directive, and the EU MDR, of course, the new regulation. Now, when the EU MDR came into force, there was a significant change when it came to software devices. So as a bit of a backstory, under the previous old EU Medical Device Directive, a lot of software devices were class 1. So in the UK and the EU, we have 3 classifications of medical devices: a class 1, class 2A and class 2B, and a class 3, effectively. A class 1 device is self-certified. So you put it onto the market, you don't necessarily have an external audit conducted, and that's how the process goes. And that's how software was generally treated. However, when EU MDR came in force, it came up with something known as Rule 11. Under Rule 11, software intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes is classified as a class 2A. That generally fits the description of most software as a medical device products. So what does this now mean? This now means that these software can no longer be self-certified. You have to have an external audit conducted on your technical files as part of the EU MDR, and that's conducted by an external body known as a notified body in the EU or an approved body in the UK. Also with the EU MDR, it's something known as Article 10, which now requires a full quality management system. Previously, under the old EU Medical Device Directive, a lot of people didn't know this, but because software as a medical device products fell under Class 1, they didn't require a full quality management system. They simply needed post-market surveillance, CAPA, product registration, advanced written reporting, and that was it. And like I mentioned, the UK MDR is almost identical to the previous EU MDD. So what that means is the UK at this current moment in time has a strategic advantage when it comes to marketing software as a medical device products, because we'll fall under Class 1 and there'll be a lot less regulatory framework to have to overcome. So what exactly is a medical device? So I've got the definition here for the EU and I've got the definition here for the US, and I've underlined in red generally the kind of things that a medical device will fall under. So medical device means any instrument. So like I said, for example, with a software medical device, you may have a physical data collection tool. Any software intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or and in combination, i.e. if there's any accessories involved, for human beings for one or more of the following specific medical purposes: diagnosing, monitoring, prediction, and disease, or diagnosing injury or disability, or investigation purposes. And the US generally has quite a similar definition. But when I was talking about Rule 11, if we look onto the table on the right, this basically puts in perspective what that Rule 11 is and how this will classify your medical device. So like I said, at minimum, it will be a Class 2A. And there's 2 ways of looking at it. So the first of all is, what is the significance of the information? Is it considered low? It's just informing clinical management. So it's just making maybe a physician aware of what's going on. Medium is driving clinical management. So maybe it's making suggestions or providing data that would drive that clinical management. And high means that it's actually treating or diagnosing something. And of course, what would the impact of that be? Is it non-serious? It's not really going to cause any injuries. Is it serious? It may cause injury or harm. And of course, if it's critical, then basically that could mean somebody that may die as a result of it. And you can see how the classification changes basically on that. So this table basically gets rule 11 and just puts it in an easy to understand table and goes to show how what your device is doing can drive basically the classification of the device. So if we look at it from a UK's perspective, is your software even considered a regulated medical device? The reason being, there's a lot of fitness products out there, health products, well-being products that are maybe in grey areas or maybe don't fall under the scope of a medical device. And the most popular one, of course, is decision support software, something I can touch on to later on. So your software is unlikely to be a device if it's just reproducing a paper document, i.e. if you just go into a physician's office and there's a pre-medical questionnaire, you know, what kind of medication are you on? Where's you based, your home, your address? Do you currently have any illnesses, etc.? That wouldn't really be considered a medical device. You're basically just getting a paper form and just making an electronic version of it. So it's following the path of a procedure or treatment. So there's no decisions being made. This might just be a guidance doc that a doctor just sent you. And of course, if it's only offering lifestyle treatment sources or it's just referring you to a GP. So it may be an app out there that asks you certain questions to say, okay, with what you've described, I highly recommend that you go and see a general practitioner to get better advice on this. However, software will be a device if it's linked to a specific medicine or device. So even if it's just an accessory. And of course, an important one here is if it's intended to influence the actual treatment, dose, size of an implant, or type of treatment. I've seen a lot of telehealth software platforms out there that will not fall under the scope of a medical device. But because they start mentioning things like dose, when to take it, how to take it, the size of the dose, they start nudging onto a medical device. And of course, if it's diagnosing or providing a prognosis, as I talked about in the previous definition, then it will be classed as a medical device. So if we look at it from a USA perspective, the best example that I can probably give is known as general wellness products. So if we look at it here, so making things claims such as preventing injuries, expediting recovery, or providing specific diagnostic information will probably nudge you towards a medical device. If you're just going to be making claims such as increased motivation to exercise, maybe just living with a particular injury that you may have, or encouraging exercise or tracking, then it would just fall under the definition of a non-regulated general wellness product. And this is important to know because what I've seen a lot of software medical device companies do is they often have a device that they push out there as a general wellness product, and they use that as a tool to see if there's any interest in that device. And as they begin to get data from post-market, they then basically bring that into their device, which they're working on in the background, and they begin to add additional claims into that. So that is another route that companies are taking. So does your product have a PEMS element, a programmable electrical mechanical system? This is a very, very common mistake I'm seeing with software as a medical device companies, unfortunately. Often I ask software as a medical device companies, where are you getting your data from? So for example, if there's something like an EEG-based software medical device, if that patient who's now using that software has to wear an EEG headset, you now have a physical element involved. So even if you just buy that in, as in it's branded by another company, manufactured by another company, if you're sticking your name or your label, what is required to be used as part of the intended use of your device, you effectively have to take on the role of the legal manufacturer, and you now have a physical element to your device. So what does that mean? You've now got additional testing. You're going to have electrical testing, mechanical testing, electromagnetic compatibility. If you're touching parts of the body, you're going to need to be doing biocompatibility. In addition to that, there's going to be extra parts of your quality management system. You need to not just have design controls for your software part, but you also need to have design controls for the physical element. You're also going to have to deal with production facilities, possibly even sterilization, storage, distribution. And of course, the most important one is an adverse event report. If your product goes wrong on the market and is software based, you can simply shut down the platform to get a recall. But when you're dealing with a physical product, you then have to have effectively the manpower for people to actually go out there and collect the defective devices. So this is an important consideration. There's nothing wrong with having a PEMS element, but just be aware there's extra work involved, and you're not just software only. You do have a physical product that you need to deal with. So where to start with regulating your software as a medical device? So my favorite thing that I like to do is something known as an intended use statement. So we start off with what's basically called the intended medical indication. And just as a bit of a background, the reason I say an intended use statement is until you know what your device actually is, the people it's going to treat, and the claims you're going to be making, you will not be able to start with your clinical investigations because you will not know what you're looking for. And number two, you will not be able to start writing your technical files because you will not know how to test the performance of your device. Hence why I say it's very important. This is a step that you should seriously invest a lot of time into. So we start off with what's known as the intended medical indication. What are the conditions or diseases, and are you screening them? Are you monitoring them? Are you treating them? Are you diagnosing? Are you preventing? Or is it a combination of them, which is fine. So the intended medical indication can be sort of quite broad and narrow, and it's often important for the manufacturer to clearly specify what this is basically and give any accompanying documentation for that. Number two, of course, is the intended patient population. What are the demographics of these people? Where in the world are they based? What are their genders? Are this somebody from males? Is it females? Or is that not relevant? What's the age groups? Are we talking about adults? And you have to be specific and provide the age groups, because people don't realize around the world, adult can have a different definition. Some countries may class it as 16, some countries may class it as 18, some as 21. So it's important that you put the age groups in there. What are the weight ranges of these people? What is their health? Are they living with any conditions? Do the people have existing disabilities that you need to factor into? May they be hard of hearing? May they be hard of sight? This is something that you need to factor into your device. And of course, the intended user groups. What are the qualifications and experiences needed to be able to operate this device effectively? So if we look at something like primary users, that might be a radiographer. So if you have something like a PACS viewer, the primary user will be a radiographer. But you also have to factor in secondary uses. That radiographer may be sitting there and diagnosing and using that software, but then they may also make that software available for a nurse who's assisting them. So you also have to factor that in there. Intended parts of the body. So this is more to do with if you have a PEMS element, a physical element, which parts of the body is it going to be part of? And of course, the intended environment. Does this device need to be sterile? Is it non-sterile? Is it single use? Is it reusable? If it's reusable, does it need cleaning? Does it need re-sterilization? Does it need reprocessing? Is it going to be used in a hospital environment? Is it going to be used in a home environment? Is it going to be used in an ambulance where there's going to be a lot of noise, a lot of distractions about? Is it going to be used something in a hospital? Is it going to be wall mounted? And of course, the most important part of your intended use statement, the operating principle. How exactly are you supposed to use that device to achieve the intended use? Only then, once you have the answers to these questions and you've thought it through, can you begin to start thinking about your clinical evaluation plan and, of course, what your regulatory strategy is effectively going to be. So, of course, the second most important question, what exactly are the documentation requirements? So there's two types of documentation involved. We have a quality management system, and then we have the technical files. So for those listening today who may not know, in summary, a technical file is basically the collection of documents demonstrating the safety and performance of your product. A quality management system is basically a formalized system that documents all the procedures, policies, etc., that you have in place for optimal product performance and safety. The key difference here, which a lot of companies make the mistake with, a quality management system is applied to your whole organization, whereas a technical file is specific to your product. And it's important to know the difference between. So of course, how do you go about getting the quality management system certified? What are the rules and regulations and things like that you need to work to? So for the UK, the EU, and the rest of the world, we work to a standard called ISO 13485-2016. For the UK, you want to use the BSEN version of that. And for the EU, you want to use the EN version. Now, the difference between these two is that standard, the BSEN, has been harmonized to UK regulations, whilst the EN version has been harmonized to European regulations. And of course, in the USA, we have 21 CFR 820. And of course, there's going to be additional requirements depending on the country that you're working in for reporting in that particular region, registration procedures for the relevant jurisdictions that you want to work in. So for example, if you have a device in the UK and another one in the EU, you would have a separate policy for reporting because you're dealing with different countries and different governments. And also in the EU MDR, there's something known as Article 10, which has its own basic quality management system requirements, but that is largely covered by ISO 13485 apart from the relevant jurisdiction requirements. So what exactly are the typical documents in a quality management system? You're going to have things like management review, you're going to have things like documentation controls, resource controls, risk management, internal auditing, external auditing, unannounced audits, corrective actions, statistical analysis, design controls, purchasing, post-market surveillance, feedback, complaints, basically all the information that you need for optimal product quality. And in terms of how this process works is for 21 CFR 820, the USA doesn't necessarily audit you for this. There's no specific documentation in place for that. Whereas in the UK, EU, and the rest of the world, for ISO 13485, this is a documented process. And you basically need a certification, which is done in the stage of a two-stage audit. So an initial audit and a second audit. And the only people that can do this are basically notified and approved bodies, Whereas obviously with 21 CFR 820, you're kind of expected to have a quality management system. The FDA won't necessarily audit you on that specifically. So now we move on to technical documentation. So technical documentation includes, but it's not limited to, things like compliance checklists. So like I touched on with the UK and the EU, we've got the GDPR. You want a compliance checklist to the UK MDR, the EU MDR, 510K, and of course within the FDA, sometimes there are devices out there that have special controls. Clinical, we want investigation plans, evaluation reports, studies, etc. Then we also have software specific requirements. So what is the architecture of the software? What does the design look for? What exactly is the installation and configuration process? Verification and validation, that's very important as well. And then reports. Of course, we have the risk of the risk management plan and report, and that may feed into your quality management system as well. So you would do a risk on the product, but you also do a risk on the processes as well. And of course, post-market, what's your surveillance plan? What's your clinical follow-up plan? And of course, the EU has a requirement for periodic safety update reports as per the EU MDR. And then, of course, like what I touched on earlier, we have jurisdiction-specific requirements. So within the UK and the EU, as part of the GDPR, for cybersecurity, needs what's known as a data rep. If you want to sell in the UK and you don't have an entity there, you need a UK representative. Likewise, with the EU, you need a EU representative. And also with the US as well, you need a US agent. Of course, if you want to go to the UK, you need a UK approved body to audit you for UKCA. If you want to go to the EU, you need an EU notified body to basically certify you as part of your CE. And also within the MDR, new requirement that came in place was a person responsible for regulatory compliance. So what that basically means is that is the go-to person in an organization for anything to do with regulatory affairs. That can be anybody with a relevant qualification with 1 year's experience within quality and regulatory, or somebody that doesn't hold a specific qualification but has 4 years experience within quality and regulatory. Now that job can be outsourced, and I don't know off the top of my head, but I believe is as long as your company has less than 50 employees and does less than 10 million euros in turnover, you can outsource that. If your company does not meet that requirement, then it would need to be an internal resource for the PRRC. Also, a very, very important factor, what people don't realize is at this current moment in time, when the EU transitioned from the old medical device directive to the new MDR, we lost quite a few number of notified bodies. So there's now less people that can certify you. To make matters worse, every notified body has something known as a scope. Not every notified body has the resources or the required expertise to be able to regulate a medical device. Hence, that scope drops even further. In my experience, I have seen notified bodies now quoting over a year before they're able to even look at your technical file. So the question I said earlier at the start is, which market should you go to first? That is an important consideration. If you're going to have to wait anywhere from 12 months up to 2 years to get your device on the market, you may want to look elsewhere outside of the EU. So again, which market to enter first? So this is the most common question that I'm getting with the EU MDR. So as with the limitations that I discussed earlier on, a lot of people are looking into places such as the USA, which in theory, you may be able to get your medical device on the market first. However, I say don't look to see where it's easiest to get your medical device on the market. Look to see where is your device going to be having the most impact. So look at it from a health economist point of view. Where is my device going to have the most impact? Is it even economically viable for me to reach there? And again, like I said, with the UK, it may be even strategic for you to go to the UK. As I mentioned, within the UK, a lot of these software devices are class 1, therefore self-certified. You don't need a notified body audit. This is something that you can just register and put onto the market for. The registration fees are probably looking at about £200. So that may be something that you want to look into. But in terms of which markets to enter first, the top questions you want to ask yourself is the first one. So what problem is the application intended to solve? Who is it designed for? And how much of the population within that region would benefit? So will your product have a benefit in that region? So if you're treating or diagnosing a specific disease or condition, is that condition even prevalent in the UK or the EU in the USA? How much of the population would benefit from this device? You know, it may be that there's a certain disease or condition that's quite prevalent in the UK. So even though US market access may be easier for you, maybe the UK market you want to look into, or it may be the cases that the condition you're really looking into is quite specific in the EU. So it may be worthwhile that 1 to 2 year wait rather than you investing resources and putting your product onto the US market where maybe it's not so popular. Number 2 is, what demographic has your current clinical research been based on? Is it representative of the population in that region? The reason I say this, I came across a device one time that was taking images using a mobile phone. It would take pictures of the skin, and it was able to detect certain types of skin cancer. The only issue with that device that I found was all of the people that they did their clinical research on and studies, etc., was based on a Fitzpatrick scale of 1 and 2, which was people are basically of fair skin, which limited the scope of the region that that device can go onto. It's only going to be able to be sold in markets where people have fair skin. If they want to go to markets where people have darker skin tone, their device isn't going to work without having to have extra clinical data. So that's also an important consideration. Number 3, what are the IT infrastructure requirements? And this is a very important one, especially in the UK. So for anyone in the audience who's ever come to the UK before, and you visit one of the UK hospitals, you would often notice that the infrastructure in the hospitals is often 10 years older than the computers you have at home. So if you've created a software that requires a lot of random access memory, a lot of GPU power, the hospitals will not be able to take that on board. So that's an important consideration. Number 4, does the application conform to the medical device regulations in the country? You know, are you making claims that that country won't accept? That's something you need to look into. Number 5, of course, is there return on investment? Look at it from a health economist point of view. Number 6, have you discussed your options with a health economist? You know, the thousands or hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of dollars that you're going to spend putting a product onto the market. If you just spend anywhere from $100 or up to thousands, that's going to save you a lot of money in the long run if they tell you that your product's not going to be viable in a certain market. And of course, number 7, what are the training requirements for your product to use in relation to the competency of the users? You know, does it require someone who's had to study a PhD for 10 years and is a heavily experienced radiographer? How many of those people exist in the world? Or is it going to be the device that a lay user, that somebody at home can use? So these are the questions you need to ask first. Once you have the answer to them, then you know what market you can enter. So in summary, the determination of whether your software product is a medical device and its risk classification is driven by its intended use. The regulatory and clinical process can take quite long, so the earlier you start, the better off you are. And there's a lot of hype at the moment of AI and software replacing physicians, but at this current moment in time, it's more of an assistance tool rather than something to take over. And of course, the most important one here for UK and EU market access, what capacity does the approved or notified body have? Can you wait over a year? Thank you all for listening.
Great. Thanks, Karen Deep. With that, we will turn it over to Isabella here. And Karen Deep, I mean, just to summarize a little bit of that too, I loved the which market do you go to first and the insight there. The QMS versus a technical file. I mean, I'm not a regulatory expert, so it wasn't something I was really aware of. The physical element of the device, also something you don't really think about too often. And then I have some questions as well for you at the end. But Isabella, if you're ready to share your screen, then you can take it from here.
Are you seeing my screen or are you seeing the presenter screen? I'm not sure which one you're seeing.
We're seeing the presentation screen.
Good thing I have a bunch of notes typed in there. Hold on. All right. Better?
Perfect.
Okay. Hello, all. So I'm going to be taking more of a clinical approach to this. And so we're going to be talking about how you establish the clinical scenario for this. Oh, what is going on? Sorry, I'm having a, for some reason, all I see now is Karen Deep. Don't know what's going on. Can't see the slides.
Oh,
We can see your slides.
We can see your slides though.
Okay, but I need to be able to see them too. Okay, so can you see them still? We're good? Because I can see them now. Oh, no, I can't. Okay, now I can. Good grief. All right, so sorry. Okay, so starting over again, I'm going to be taking this from a more clinical perspective, but to set the stage, I think just going to cover a little bit of what an SaMD is and how they work. So basically, a software as a medical device is a software that takes some inputs, which are patient data. So think your lab tests, your imaging records, physiological data, blood pressure, heart rate, things like that, demographic data or medical history data, and takes all of those inputs, one or many of them, and puts them into an algorithm. And the algorithm has an equation in it, and it applies, or it's a model, and it applies different weights to different of those inputs to come out with an output. And the output is the part that is clinically meaningful, that is going to be used by your end user to do one of these different things. So what are the different things? The different things are treat or diagnose diseases, which is, if you think about a technology that takes those inputs, generates, goes through the algorithm, comes up with an output, and maybe it's a cognitive behavioral therapy, or maybe it's a diagnosis for AFib or something. So as Karen Deep mentioned, this is usually the higher bar from a regulatory perspective, because you are actually treating or diagnosing a patient. Drive clinical management. Think of, this is sort of your triaging, it's more prognostics. It's making sure that the care that is going to be delivered anyway is more efficient and more effective. So if you think of some of these, COVID, for example. So there may be an algorithm that takes patient data and it comes out with an output that determines someone's risk level of being put in the ICU for COVID. So that would be something to drive clinical management, because it'll give the physicians and the users information that will then have them make treatment decisions for a patient. And informed clinical management is really mostly just kind of taking the information and conveying it in a different way. So it's usually putting it into an easier visual to digest. So it doesn't quite do as much analysis as the other treat and diagnose and drive clinical management typically do. So from a clinical perspective, what do you want to be considering? So you want to consider whether these three things, whether you have a valid clinical association, you want to do your analytical validation, which is a little bit less clinical, but it kind of goes into the full picture of what you need to do for an SaMD, and a clinical validation. So what do these things mean? So a valid clinical association is the extent to which the software's output is clinically accepted or well-founded. So this is basically your proof of concept. So is your output something that clinicians, FDA is going to accept as something meaningful? Is your therapy something that's well established, or is it something entirely new? If it's something that is well established, you have a bit of an easier time at least getting FDA to accept it. If you're coming up with something that's based upon an entirely new therapy or entirely new principles for diagnosis or entirely new inputs into a therapy, you're going to have to figure out how to justify that they are valid clinical associations. So how can you justify those things? Through literature, through professional guidelines, through your own proof of concept clinical testing. Analytical validation. So here you're going to think more along the technologies lines. So with the technology, you have to do V&V in all cases, right? And so when you do V&V for a product like a SaMD, you're going to be thinking about your modules. So if you have an SaMD that has multiple modules to it, you want to make sure that each of the outputs for your modules are what you expect them to be, given the inputs that you give them. So are they accurately, reliably, and precisely giving you the expected outputs so that the final output is what you expect as well? You want to make sure that your user interface looks like it's supposed to, so that if someone enters their name or enters some patient information into a field, that it is appropriately put into the rest of the software. Things like bugs, you might want to think, okay, or error messages, you want to run through and make sure that all of those things are performing as expected. Clinical validation is the sort of the big kahuna. It's what everybody typically thinks of when they think of validating an algorithm. And this is really your clinical studies to show that your outputs are being used in a way that is appropriate to patient care so that it doesn't create adverse effects. So if you say you're diagnosing something, that you are actually diagnosing that thing. So it's not just that you're getting the output that you expected, but that output is clinically meaningful and is being used in a way that appropriately affects clinical care. So how can you design studies that meet these needs and make sure that you're covering everything that you need to in those studies and you're not missing anything? So there are some key principles of good machine learning practice, and this is basically taken from other areas of AI and things. And so these are well-established principles in the software space. And they apply very well to healthcare. FDA brings up these points a whole lot, so it's important to understand them. And so the first thing is understanding how your technology fits into the clinical workflow. So how is a physician supposed to interpret the information that they're getting, and what are they supposed to do with that information? Or how is a patient supposed to interpret that information, and what are they supposed to do with that information? Where does it fit in? And then you want to make sure that the data that you're using, so when you design your study, the inclusion criteria and the things that you're collecting through case report forms and things like that, are generalizable to the intended use population. So you want to make sure that you really understand your inputs and how they affect the outputs. So you want to understand, do I need to collect the weight of these patients? Do I need to be mindful of skin color if you're using sort of a dermatology analysis technology, things like that. You want to make sure that you're very inclusive in the patient population to avoid bias in the algorithm. Because, for example, if you're using a dermatology AI that's looking for melanomas, and you only use folks from Sweden, right? So light skin color, light hair color, it's not going to be able to accurately identify melanoma in people with different skin colors. So you want to be considerate of all of those different factors that go into your intended use population. Make sure that that data is generalizable, and that's the word FDA will use, generalizable. You want to make sure that your training data sets, so the data sets that you use to train the algorithm, are independent from your test data sets. So they're not the same data sets that you're using for your clinical validation, because obviously that would create bias. You'd just be checking it with itself. But this can go so far as to not even using the same sites, or if you do use the same sites, you have to have a certain time gap between when you got your test data set or your training data sets to when you're doing your test data sets. When you select your reference data sets, make sure that they're based upon the best available method. So you want to make sure that they're appropriately characterized for their intended use, that basically you're using data sets that are meaningful to whatever you're designing this technology to do. And you want to test it in clinically relevant conditions. So you want to make sure it's being used in the intended use case, with the intended users, in the intended use environment, on the intended use population. So all of those things, don't change them up. I know lots of times I'll meet with algorithm developers, small sponsor companies, and they'll want to start tweaking things during their validation data set to test it in a different use case, or to not specify really well the patient population. And you really need to be specific for this, especially if you're going to engage with a regulatory body, especially like FDA. They're very linear thinkers. And so the more variables that you're adding into this that stray away from your intended use situation, the more confusing and the more complex your conversations are going to get, and you're going to have a hard time getting on the same page. And then after you've gone through and gotten your clearance or approval, you want to make sure that you're monitoring the technology over its life cycle. So it's going to be out there in the world. It's going to be exposed to real world situations. Are you learning anything? Is it still performing as it was expected to perform? Do you have to do anything to make its performance better? Have you started retraining things? You need to then validate it if you've retrained it. So just be mindful of all of those things. Make sure that you really understand. I think the crux of this is that you really understand how you expect this technology to be used, on whom and by who, and really characterize those things when you're designing. Can't do any of the things to support 1, 2, and 3. So 1, 2, and 3 meaning valid clinical association, analytical validation, or clinical validation. You may need to do some of these things, and these are not things that you typically want to do, but if you can't meet those things, you're going to have a hard time getting through a regulatory approval or clearance. So you may need to modify your intended use. So maybe you can reduce your claims to meet one of these or all 3 of these criteria. Or maybe you could change your claims to a different patient population. You may need to make changes to the software if you're not likely to meet criteria 2 or consideration 2. So if you're not getting the expected outputs, there's something going wrong there. I already said you could change the patient population or target clinical association, or you may need to just gather some more data and perform some more data analysis. So maybe you can't establish that valid clinical association. Maybe you need to go out there and do some more proof of concept testing, or maybe for clinical validation, your sample size was too small. And so consider those types of things if you're unable to meet these considerations. So what has FDA specifically done so far to support SaMD? Because obviously lots of technologies are moving in the digital direction. So FDA is aware of that, and they put together this action plan. And so part of the action plan considered these 5 different buckets. So they wanted to come up with a predetermined change control guidance. So this is, I know I'm going to make changes in the future to this software, and here's how I'm going to manage those changes. And they had said that they wanted to release that guidance last year, but they did not. And so it's incomplete right now. They say fiscal year 2022 resources permitting, so I wouldn't hold my breath on that. The next thing is to encourage good machine learning practice. So they did publish good machine learning practice principles at the end of last year, so in October of 2021. I listed out a few of them. That's not all of them. I tried to just kind of pick the ones that were related to clinical, but you can find those on the FDA's website. They also want to ensure appropriate labeling to end users. And so they had a patient engagement advisory committee meeting. And then they got inputs from patients and users and things. And so they were then going to have a workshop. So they're still compiling all the information that they obtained from that advisory committee panel. And so that workshop is still TBD. Regulatory research methods. So they have started, and they've been working with places like Stanford and things to understand a bit more about the things that they need to consider for AI. But they've also formed an FDA AI group. And so they have a special unit that's kind of focused on these things now. And then there's a voluntary program to work with companies to understand how to analyze and interpret real world data and how real world data will fit into the picture for software as medical device and machine learning products. And so that concludes my talk. Connect with me on LinkedIn. There's all my information. I think the slides will be shared. There's information for Proxima, which is the company that I'm director of regulatory affairs for. And then I also have, we have a podcast, Inventing Tomorrow, and we cover lots of different things about topics for development. And then there's M1 MedTech Accelerator, which is a MedTech accelerator that I'm a principal for. And so we help companies understand everything they know to be successful. That is all I have to say. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Isabella. And thanks for staying on and joining after the FDA call and everything. So a couple things. So we have one question that I'm going to get to in a second here, but I had jotted down some questions and some comments as well. So Isabella, in your presentation, you talked about the clinical workflow, where does it fit in? And Karen Deep, in yours, you talked about a stepwise approach, right, from a regulatory standpoint. And I just wanted to tie both of those together because I think that's really important. Something that people with these kind of products have to think about. And Karen Deep, you showed the graph, right, of a class 3 where you're making these decisions. The other thing, for the flip side of that, is if you're replacing doctors and you're going into the clinic saying, well, I'm going to replace this step for a doctor, I don't know how successful you would be in convincing that doctor or that hospital to use the technology, right? So there is that thought process of not only from a regulatory standpoint, does it make sense to have to, go from a regulatory side stepwise approach, but also from a clinical use side as well, is getting people to adopt that technology. If you're replacing doctors' billable hours, I doubt they're going to be on board with that. So I wanted to tie both those together because you kind of talked about it. Isabella, are you still there? I think we lost you from a video perspective.
I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm losing you from an audio perspective, so I turned off my video so that I could catch everything you were saying.
Okay, great. So we had a couple questions come in, so let me ask those first. And then if we have time, I have a few others that I jotted down, but there was a question that came in. It was, what kinds of model monitoring solutions are you seeing? I'm guessing that was for Isabella, but Isabella, if you want to answer first, then Karen Deep add on.
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely.
Okay.
I don't know,
Karen.
Karen.
Karen, do you have any comments there?
I agree with Isabella. If the listener can perhaps provide a bit more information, what specifically they're asking for.
Yeah, I can just ask to get some more information. Okay, the other one was, how about GSRP requirements for clinical evaluation as per EU MDR for SaMD? Which GSPR should one be focused on?
So GSPR is basically a set of requirements, or general safety performance requirements. From a software as a medical device point of view, a lot of the things on there are irrelevant. So things like flammability testing, etc. There are some elements of it when you have a programmable electrical mechanical system. In terms of the specific ones, that's something I need to look into. So if the listener wants to contact me directly midday after the call, perhaps provide their cash specifically and anything specific to GSPR, that's something I need to look into, but that's something I'll need to put a bit of time into to be able to give you the appropriate response for.
Great. And so Isabella, the other question was for you, and it was GMLP, model monitoring is required. And so I think that's what they were talking about when they were asking for what kinds of model monitoring solutions are you seeing? Does that make more sense now?
I would say I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
I don't know if it makes more sense, and I just don't know the answer, or I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah, it's no problem. Okay, we have another question that came in. What reference resources for FDA submissions would you recommend? And this is probably to both of you. So Karen Deep, you want to start, and then Isabella?
Yeah, so specifically for software, I will look into the general wellness guidance and of course, clinical decision support guidance. Those for me are the two key ones, and it seems a lot of where software is going. But the FDA as well, they're quite good. So even if there isn't a guidance out there, the beauty of the FDA is that you can contact them directly with the questions that you have. So even if there isn't a guidance there, don't be afraid to contact the FDA directly if the answer is not immediately available.
So I would say I agree, consider those two guidance documents, especially if you're trying to determine whether you're actually a regulated product or not, or if you're able to kind of be under enforcement discretion. If you are confirmed that you're a regulated product, you obviously want to take a look at the content for pre-market submissions for software. There's also a guidance document for mobile medical applications that you may want to take a look at. There's also obviously cybersecurity is a big thing for SaMDs. You want to determine how you're connected to other products and the cloud. And then you can also reach out to DICE, which is an FDA website. They can guide you to some additional resources or answer high-level questions. Also, obviously, pre-submission meetings are pretty key with SaMDs, I would say. Because usually you're doing something slightly different, even if you're a 510K, and anytime you're doing something slightly different, it's best to just talk to FDA about what you're doing and make sure that your plans are adequate. I think that covers, and the FDA also has a digital health group as well that you can reach out to for specific questions about digital health. And when you reach out to their emails, they usually give you pretty high level answers, and they seem really high level to me because I'm so familiar with it. But I think if you're not very familiar, it's still valuable, the high level answers. And even for me, sometimes it's just a good sanity check.
Okay, great. And so real quick, Isabella, so Karen Deep and yourself have both been on Project MedTech's podcast, and then on the episode I did with Karen Deep, he had mentioned that ours centered around software as a medical device, and he said, the FDA was doing a great job at, dealing with software as a medical device, and it's new and it's coming out, and so I'm curious is what your thoughts are on that. I mean, it seems like, based on what you've said, that the FDA has been providing a lot of resources into this, and it's a difficult task to try to regulate an industry that a lot of people really don't know a lot about. So I'm curious on your thoughts on how the FDA has been handling it.
I'm trying to turn on my camera when I answer questions. So the FDA, I think, obviously they have initiatives going forward to understand software as a medical device better. They actually have a position open right now for digital health advisors. And so they are pushing and making an effort to understand these technologies better. I think they have something like 343 AI ML products now, or products that have incorporated AI and machine learning in them. And so that's a good bit. It's kind of not a good bit relative to the amount of device submissions that they actually see. But in my experience, and I've worked with quite a few of them, they're open to, there are challenges because a lot of the review teams are more accustomed to reviewing hardware medical devices and understanding how those technologies fit into the clinical workflow and the clinical paradigm. And they understand less about sort of how algorithms work in general and the way inputs affect algorithms. And so there's a bit of education, but they are making an effort to educate themselves as well by hiring folks and things. Generally speaking, though, FDA is having a bit of a struggle with their staffing and resources right now. So, be mindful of that when you are considering any technology, but also a software as a medical device.
Okay, good to know. Karen Deep, real quick, you brought up, you showed the different classes in your presentation, and we've talked about clinical decision support software, and then maybe you start there and then you go to the next step, and you can go to the next step from a stepwise regulatory approach. Are you aware of any companies or products that said, nope, we're going straight in, it's a class 3 software, and there was no like CDS or anything like that, the stepwise, they just went all in for the what seemed like the most regulatory compliance?
I wish they would at times, but it's quite the opposite. I mean, it's often
Okay.
you want to take the easiest route. It's human nature, isn't
Yeah.
it? And they're always trying to fight their corner, and I can only guide people so much. The guidance is there. Like, if it's written there in black and white that you're a class 3 and they want to fight it, then I've done my part.
Okay, very good. And so we have a couple other questions that have kind of popped in here. From an AI perspective, I understand the validation is more on the clinical side. What kind of software verification are you seeing as part of the regulatory deliverable? Probably for both of you.
So from a regulatory point of view, actually, one that people miss out, and especially software as a medical device company, is on the QMS, actually. And this, so people understand that their software actually needs to be validated. But as part of your quality management system, if you're going to be using things like online platforms, document storage, things like, Dropbox, Jira, any of these online platforms, that also needs to be validated. And a lot of companies are making the mistake thinking that software validation is the product only. not realizing there's processes out there that also require software validation. So that's something companies really need to look out for.
Yeah, as far as the validation of like the verification of the software, that's usually along those analytical validation lines that I was talking about too. So you're testing if you have a multi-module software, for example, and some softwares are very complex. You want to make sure that each module's output is appropriate. That if there are error messages, for example, that need to pop up, if something, you know, there's an input that's erroneous or it's missing something that it needs as far as an input, that those things are actually happening. So those are the type of verification things that you want to consider when you're developing the software and you're going through that verification plan. And
Okay.
then that'll be based on, you know, obviously your design inputs, risk matrix, you know, and again, include cybersecurity and all of that. I think a lot of companies, in my experience, put cybersecurity like off to the end, and then they have unrealistic expectations about what needs to happen. And so just be mindful of that in the early stages.
Yeah, and just a plug for some of the Galen team. I did have one of the founders, Abbas, on from Galen did to talk about cybersecurity on the podcast. I forget what number it is, but if people want more information on that, Abbas did a very good job of summarizing the importance of cybersecurity and why you should think about that early. So just for everyone who's still on, you know, generally we end this at 1 o'clock Central, 2 o'clock Eastern, but we still have questions trickling in. So if people want to stay on, we're going to keep going with this. So just wanted to make that quick announcement. And those for who are hopping off, March 29th is the next Galen webinar series. So another question that came in is what one should be informed about development models while developing SaMD? Are there pros and cons of going agile development method? I don't know if either one of you have a thought on this. It seems very product development side of things, but if you guys have thoughts, then let it rip.
I think knowing software developers that their specific methodology is something that they're going to want to define themselves, as long as it's meeting things like 62304, and you can use agile to meet 62304, as long as you're generating the documentation that's necessary. I think the methodology that you use to do that is really up to the software developer, and I would say that they're pretty particular on what they want to use and how they like their workflows to go.
Okay, Karen Deep.
I completely agree with that. It's down to personal preference and what the software engineers are used to working with and how the organization wants to go about it.
Okay, awesome. I think that is let me just make sure. I think we answered every question that was written in. Isabella, I had one more question. You brought it up about having an inclusive patient population and really like that post the post-market surveillance, right? So I mean, post-market surveillance is really important for all medical devices, right? But can you just dig in a little bit more to the crux of the issue with software? My understanding of it is that as the algorithm takes in more data, the worry is that it could become more biased. Is that kind of what the crux of the issue is? Because in a clinical trial, you can control. I mean, you brought up skin pigmentation, for instance, right? In a clinical trial, you can control the inputs there. But when it gets into the real world, what if a certain population is the only ones using that product? How do you prevent that?
Yeah, so I yes, that is part of the issue. I think the other part of, I mean, you could lock the algorithm, right? And so if you don't have a continuous learning algorithm and you're not doing reinforcement learning, that addresses it. But having a continuous learning algorithm has benefits, and so I think it's one of the things that FDA wants to consider and how to approach that. And I think in order to do that, you know, they're considering things like the predetermined change control plan and learning how to interpret the real world evidence, and making sure that if you are continuously training, that you're also validating those data sets. And so to your point, yes, that could be an issue, and that's one of the things that FDA is talking about and wanting to consider with that. It could also, like, you know, the flip side of that, and the reason why it's not just lock it and that's it, is that larger data sets generally make the algorithms better, right? And so how far we've come now with algorithms and things is because we have access to these massive amounts of data that we didn't used to have access to. And so we're able to develop these algorithms to do things that previously they couldn't do. And so it is good to be able to either obtain that data and then retrain it later, or to be able to do that continuous learning. But we just have to be considerate of things like the generalizability of the algorithm and what that real world evidence data actually looks like, and be mindful of that. And so monitoring what that actually looks like, who is using the device, to your point, things like that, what types of issues, you know, the same as with any hardware device too, what types of complaints or issues or errors are coming up to address those. So all of those things are important on the post-market surveillance side as well, and you know, supporting future potential submissions.
Awesome. It does. So, well, great. There's no other questions coming in. The ones that I had jotted down, both of you have answered. I cannot express to you that this was a absolutely phenomenal presentation by both Karen Deep and Isabella on a really hot topic. I've talked to, we've done 80 some episodes of the podcast. They've both been on it, but this presentation of this material with both PowerPoints, unbelievably clear. It's one of the best presentations from both of you that I've seen. You actually made regulatory captivating, which is, and clinical, which is not incredibly easy to do, right? So I really appreciated both of you, both your time. Galen data really knocked this one out of the park in terms of a topic here. So Karen Deep, Isabella, thank you so much for your time. Listeners who are still on, you know, check out galendata.com. If you have others who are interested in this space, they can always go to galendata.com. They go to webinars, and I think they can RSVP and get a recording of this when it's done as well. And I think anyone who attended will get a recording. But with that being said, Isabella, Karen Deep, thank you both so much for your time today. Fantastic presentation, both very knowledgeable, and anyone listening should connect with both of them on LinkedIn. With that being said, thanks everyone. Thank you for joining today, and we'll talk soon.